Project Delivery Applications, Delivering Scope, Requirements, and Structured Project Works. It's the week 3 Project Delivery Applications class. So I just want to say, first of all, that you guys here on the call reflects your commitment to your education and professional growth and your future in project management. I think that's commendable that you're here. In this session, we're going to move from project initiation into the next major step of the project lifecycle, which is planning the project scope. This is the point where the project begins to take on a clear structure. Instead of relying on the initial vision, charter, and stakeholder information developed earlier, the project team now works to define what the project is expected to deliver, what work is included, and how the work should be organized. And this lecture focuses on several connected topics that support that transition. We'll discuss developing project scope, the planning processes that support scope development, stakeholder engagement and communication and planning, and the role of requirement management system. We'll also connect those ideas directly to week 3 course project deliverables, including the scope management. The plan project scope management, WBS and WBS Dictionary are the deliverables. And the overall goal for this week is to understand how projects move from initiation into a more formal, manageable planning foundation. In other words, this is where the broad project intent begins to become structured project work. This week focuses on defining project scope, organizing planning processes, engaging stakeholders, and building scope artifacts that support delivering planning. So again, as I mentioned, we'll focus on the next major step in the project lifecycle, which is developing project scope. We'll begin by looking at how scope is defined and why it matters for turning the broad concept into something more structured and manageable. Then we'll examine the connected planning processes that support scope development, including scope planning, requirements definition, scope definition, and the creation of the work breakdown structure. And we'll also discuss the key scope artifacts for the project week 3 course project, which include the scope management plan, the scope statement, WBS and WBS Dictionary. When we look at the role of stakeholder engagement strategy and requirement management in shaping scope, emphasizing that both are iterative and continue to evolve throughout the project lifecycle. And finally, we'll connect this week's work to the course project assignment, and then we'll preview how these artifacts become the planning inputs for week 4, which is schedule and implementation planning. Developing project scope. Developing project scope clarifies what the project will deliver, what work is included, and where the project boundaries lie. At this stage of the project, the work is moving from initiation into a clearer definition of scope. Developing the project scope means deciding what the project is expected to deliver, what work is included in the effort, and where the boundaries of the project should be drawn. This is important because project may begin with a general idea, a business need, or a vision, but those starting points are usually not detailed enough to guide the rest of the planning work. The project manager and stakeholders need to build a shared understanding of what the project is supposed to accomplish and what the project is not intended to do. In practical terms, scope development helps answer several key questions. What are we trying to deliver? What work belongs inside the project? What should remain outside the project? What assumptions and constraints affect the work? These questions help reduce ambiguity and create a stronger basis for planning. It's also why scope definition is often iterative. Stakeholders may begin with a broad understanding of the project, but that understanding becomes clearer as requirements are discussed and deliverables are organized. For the course project, you're only expected to produce a high-level definition of scope. It's not a real detailed scope statement like you would in practice, but the goal is the same. It's to move from a broad concept to a more structured, manageable understanding of your project. Project management planning processes. Project scope is developed through connected planning processes that move the project from a broad intent to organized, manageable work. Developing project scope is not a single action. It's supported by a set of connecting planning processes that help move the project from a broad idea to a clearer and more organized definition of work. The first of these is the develop project management plan, which brings together the major planning components of the project and establishes how the project will be managed overall. Within the broader planning effort, plan scope management defines how the scope will be developed, validated, and controlled. The next is collect requirements, which focuses on identifying stakeholder needs and expectations so that the project team understands what the project should accomplish. Those requirements then support the defined scope, where the team develops a clearer statement of the project's deliverables, boundaries, assumptions, and constraints. And finally, the Create WBS organizes the work into manageable components so the project can be planned, communicated, and controlled more effectively. Together, these processes provide structure. They help reduce uncertainty, support shared understanding, and create the foundation for the week 3 deliverables. For this course, the most important idea is that scope planning is a progression. It moves from overall planning to scope planning to requirements to scope definition, then to structured work organization. And one of the things I want to point out here is that the prior language to PMBOK 8 was for the work breakdown structure, they now just call it project structure and creating a project structure. And that can be in different forms, and we'll look at some of those. But the project structure idea or concept fits better with the other adaptive and hybrid approaches where you might not have a real connected structure like we see on the screen here under the Create WBS. The scope management plan or statement. The scope management plan explains how project scope will be defined, developed, verified, and controlled. The scope management plan, it's an artifact that explains how the project team will manage scope throughout the project. Rather than defining the scope itself, this plan describes the approach the team will use to develop, validate, and control scope. At a high level, the scope management plan explains how requirements will be collected, how the project scope statement will be developed, how the work structure will be created, how the scope will be verified, and how the team will control changes to scope over time. In other words, it provides a process framework for managing work. In other words, it's the rules of how you're going to develop scope. In here, you would identify like stakeholders that are going to participate in these things. You're going to have planning meetings and brainstorming issues. You lay all that out and come to an agreement on how that's going to work. All this is important because good scope management doesn't happen by accident. If the team doesn't have a clear approach for gathering requirements or defining boundaries or organizing work and controlling changes, the project can quickly become unstable. The scope management plan helps to create consistency and discipline around all those activities. And the expectation for this course project is a high-level scope management plan or statement rather than a fully detailed enterprise type document. The purpose is to show that you understand how scope planning should be approached according to guidelines and communicate that approach in a clear and professional way. Project scope statement. The project scope statement defines the project's major deliverables, boundaries, assumptions, and constraints. It's the artifact used to formally define the scope of the project. The purpose is to describe what's expected to deliver, establish project boundaries, and create a common understanding among stakeholders in the project team about what's included in the project and what's not. A strong project scope statement typically identifies the major deliverables, clarifies in-scope and out-of-scope work, and documents important assumptions and constraints. This helps to reduce confusion early in the project, especially when stakeholders may have different expectations about what the project is supposed to accomplish. The original purpose of the scope statement is not simply to be brief or simplified. In practice, it's an important formal scope defining artifact that supports communication, planning, and control. For the course project, however, you're being asked to produce a high-level version of the project scope statement rather than a fully developed enterprise-level document, as with the other documents. Again, the goal here is to demonstrate understanding of the purpose and structure of the artifact while applying it in appropriate level for your assignment. It's also important to note that the project scope statement is part of the scope baseline, along with the work breakdown structure, the work breakdown structure dictionary. The baseline forms the approved foundation for understanding and managing project scope. One way to think about project scope is a maritime analogy. And you'll find in project management a lot of what we have, like schedule terms like float and slack and those sort of things, all kind of have a maritime analogy to go with them. A lot of them come out of that use. But like the scope of an anchor line connecting a ship or a boat, the project scope is about defined extent, controlled reach, and clear boundaries. It's helpful analogy for remembering the idea of project scope is this nautical use of scope. Can refer to the length of an anchor cable that's laid out. More broadly, the word scope refers to the extent, range, or reach. So if you think about a boat or a ship that's at anchor, the wind can kind of blow it around. And so scope is all of that area that the boat can cover while it's anchored. And so the anchor and the chain provide that scope of the boundaries of where the ship can move. It makes for a useful project management comparison because a project also needs a defined extent. It helps to be clear how far the work reaches, what's included, and where the boundaries stop. Just as a vessel needs controlled anchor scope to hold the position effectively, the project needs controlled scope to remain stable and manageable. The analogy is helpful because it reinforces that scope is not just a list of tasks, it's about a defined reach of the project. If the scope is unclear, the project can drift. If the scope expands without control, the project can become unstable. When scope is clearly defined, the team has a stronger basis for planning, communication, and control. It's not a strict one-to-one origin story, but it gives us a meaningful way to think about project scope. Defined extent, control boundaries, and enough clarity to keep the project from drifting, or enough rope to keep the project from drifting. Enough line, as you would say. A WBS and the WBS Dictionary. The WBS, or the work breakdown structure, organizes project work into manageable components, and the WBS Dictionary adds detail to clarify those components. The work breakdown structure, or WBS, is used to organize project work into smaller, more manageable components. Its purpose is to help the team take a broad scope and break it into a structured view of the work that needs to be accomplished instead of leaving the project as one large abstract effort. The WBS provides a clear hierarchy of the deliverables or work components. This structure is important because organized work is easier to understand, communicate, plan, estimate, assign, and monitor. A well-developed WBS helps the team see the major parts of the project and how the work is grouped. And so on the screen here, we've got major deliverables. These would be work packages in the project management terminology. They show them over here, the work packages. And then they're the major deliverables, and then there's work packages under these. And then you would have tasks inside all these work packages. And a lot of times I get asked, how much detail should we provide? I've always found that this one here is, if you don't include the project, it's 2 layers. And if you have the task or activities here, it would be 3 layers. My advice has always been, you want to break it down to a point where you can estimate the work, you can identify resource for it, and you can schedule it. So usually 3 levels is plenty for this. And this is another view of this, how this works. But we also have the WBS Dictionary here, which is what they're showing over here. The WBS Dictionary supports the work breakdown structure by adding explanatory detail for the work elements. While the WBS provides the structure, the dictionary helps clarify what each component means, what's included, how that work package or deliverable should be understood. In practice, it reduces confusion and supports more consistent communication among stakeholders. It's also to remember that the scope baseline consists of the scope statement, the work breakdown structure, and the work breakdown structure dictionary. A lot of times you'll see in the WBS dictionary technical specifications, acceptance criteria, just any kind of information that would be helpful when you're doing the work could be documented here. And some of the newer tools that have this graphically organized so that you could click on the work package and you can drill down into individual activities and it'll display the WBS information together. And so there's some really powerful tools out there to help with this. One of the very first ones I used that was very simple was a software called Evergreen software a long time ago. It created context diagrams similar to a work breakdown structure. And you could just click on it and drill down into the different components. It was very nice. And we have Visio will help with this, and there's other tools out there. The scope management plan supports how scope will be managed, but the baseline itself is built from these three artifacts. And so we're expected to create a high-level work breakdown structure and WBS dictionary and that demonstrate organized thinking and clear communication and alignment with the PMI expectations. It's in your PMBOK guide. It can be represented in several ways. Common ways to visualize the WBS. A work breakdown structure can be represented in several visual formats, reflecting project work structure. One important note here is that a work breakdown structure is not limited to one single visual format. Its essential purpose of the WBS is to organize the work into a structured breakdown or network of manageable components. That structure can be represented in several ways. A common version is the hierarchical org chart type of style, where the project appears at the top and then branches into major deliverables and into sub-deliverables and into activities. Another format is indented, like tabular format with a spreadsheet or something like that, which represents the same breakdown in a text-based list of numbered structure. And it sometimes may use a tree diagram, which is this tree hierarchy as well, but it may be organized a little bit differently, or even a mind map style, this is kind of a weak mind map, but in other words, but it gets the idea. It doesn't have to be structured top down. This is a Gantt view. They can be shown using a Gantt view, a Gantt-oriented view, which you can use planning software like Microsoft Project or Primavera, and I think Monday.com and some others will allow you to create this Gantt view. In Microsoft Project, you'll have this WBS ID over here next to it. So you get a combined tabular and Gantt view with Microsoft Project. And then this tabular view, again, it's a lot like the outline, but it's in a table instead of in a sort of free-form indented style like that. The most important thing, though, is to remember that the work breakdown structure is defined by its decomposition of the project work, not whether or not it's shown in boxes or an outline or a branching map. The best thing is that it shows the work and the structure so that people that are going to be doing the work better understand the context of what's going on in the project. The scope baseline, we've talked about that a little bit already, but it provides the approved foundation for understanding and managing what work is included in the project. It's an important concept. It brings together the core artifacts used to define the approved project scope. The scope baseline consists of, as we've mentioned, the project scope statement, the work breakdown structure, and the work breakdown structure dictionary. Each of these items, these artifacts, plays a different role. The scope statement defines the project's deliverables, boundaries, assumptions, and constraints. The WBS organizes the work into manageable components, kind of visualizes the work. And the WBS dictionary adds the explanatory detail to those components so they can be understood more clearly and consistently. Together, these three artifacts form the approved foundation for understanding what work is included in the project. That's why they're called the scope baseline. They give the project team a common reference point for planning and later scope-related decisions. Later on in the project, we'll be looking at project metrics, and we use the baseline as a source to base those metrics on. It's also important to distinguish the scope baseline from the scope management plan. The scope management plan explains how the scope will be managed, while the scope baseline defines what the approved scope is. Sometimes project teams mix those up, and so it's worth emphasizing the difference when you're in the process of planning a project. The stakeholder engagement strategy. Effective scope planning depends on engaging stakeholders intentionally and communicating with them in ways that match their needs. The stakeholder engagement strategy is important in scope planning because project scope is not created in isolation. Scope is shaped by stakeholder needs, expectations, requirements, influence, and decision-making authority. That means that the project's team needs more than a list of stakeholders. It also needs a strategy for how those stakeholders will be engaged as scope is developed. This also connects to our week 2 deliverables, which were in project step 1. We created the initial stakeholder register and the stakeholder management strategy or stakeholder analysis matrix. Those initiation artifacts, but they don't end with initiation. Instead, they become important planning inputs as the project moves into scope development and into broader planning work. In other words, the initial stakeholder register gives the project team an early view of who the stakeholders are, while the stakeholder management strategy begins identifying how those stakeholders should be engaged as the project moves forward. Those artifacts are extended, refined, and used to support planning decisions. And this is especially important in scope planning, where the stakeholder needs and expectations help shape requirements, deliverables, and project boundaries. This is also an iterative process. Stakeholder understanding is rarely complete at the beginning of the project. As planning continues throughout the project lifecycle and the project lifecycle advances, the team may identify new stakeholders, revise engagement strategies, adjust communication approaches, or update priorities based on changing project conditions. That's why stakeholder engagement should be understood as an ongoing process across the project lifecycle rather than a one-time initiation task. The main takeaway is that project initiation, the stakeholder artifacts serve as a starting point in planning. In week 3 and beyond, they become living planning inputs that continue to inform communication, engagement, and scope-related decisions throughout the project. The requirements management system. A requirements management system helps the project team capture, organize, trace, and refine requirements as scope is developed. A requirements management system is the structured approach the project team uses to capture, organize, and monitor requirements as the project scope is developed. The key idea is that the requirements should not remain as scattered notes or disconnected conversations or informal assumptions. They need to be documented and managed in a way that supports clarity and continuity. At a basic level, a requirements management system helps answer questions such as what requirement was identified, where did it come from, which stakeholder requested it, what's its current status, how does it connect to a deliverable or work element, if something changes, how is that change tracked? This matters because requirements often evolve as planning continues. New information may emerge, stakeholders may clarify their expectations, or the team may discover that certain requirements need refinement. A requirement management system helps the team manage that complexity in a more disciplined way. This doesn't have to be a complex software platform. It can be a structured table, a matrix, a spreadsheet, or other organized method for documenting and following requirements. The important point is that the requirements are managed systematically rather than informally. This connects directly to scope planning. Requirements help shape deliverables, boundaries, and work components. When requirements are organized and traceable, scope decisions become clearer, communication improves, and the project team is better prepared to plan and control project work. Some examples of requirements management platforms. Commercial tools can help teams capture, trace, organize, and manage requirements across the lifecycle. There's some examples here on the screen. They're commercially available platforms used to support requirements management or the broader lifecycle management. Some, such as the Doors Next, JAMA Connect, and Polarian ALM, are more directly associated with formal requirements and traceability. Others, such as Azure DevOps, are broader lifecycle platforms that can still support requirements tracking in connection to planning and the delivery of the work. So some of these are full lifecycle systems, and some of these are more requirements generated. There's one called Jira that adaptive teams use a lot. It's a full agile lifecycle management platform. So there's a lot of this out there. It's not something you need to go out and create of your own. But if you have a small project, keeping things in spreadsheet is manageable. But if you get several hundred requirements, it gets to be a little bit hard to manage if you're doing it all manually without some bigger system. We'll talk about the week 3 project artifacts here. The assignment, week 3 deliverables turn the scope planning into formal project artifacts that define, organize, and communicate the project's approved work. The week 3 assignment asks you to move from the planning concepts into actual project artifacts. The focus is on delivering 3 scope-related deliverables: the scope management plan or statement, the scope statement, and the WBS with the WBS dictionary. So technically, I guess it's 4 activities, but the WBS and WBS dictionary kind of can be treated as one. Each of these artifacts serves a different purpose. Again, the scope management plan explains how the scope will be developed, verified, and controlled. The project scope statement formally defines major deliverables, boundaries, assumptions, and constraints of the project. The WBS dictionary and the WBS then organizes and clarify the project work so it can be understood and managed more effectively. These artifacts show that the project is moving from initiation into more structured planning. They also connect directly to the PMI's planning processes, especially planning scope management, collecting requirements, defining scope, and creating the work breakdown structure. In that sense, the assignment's not about producing documents, it's about showing that you understand how the scope planning works as a connected planning effort. And so the scoring guide makes 2 things clear. Is first, the submissions should demonstrate substantial alignment with PMI standards and terminology, and they should demonstrate professional and practical communication, which is not a problem. You guys have been doing that very well. And the idea is, though, is that you don't just understand the concept, but you can put this into these artifacts. Look ahead to week 4 in step 3 of the course project. As we look forward to week 4, the course project moves from scope definition into schedule and implementation planning. In week 3, we define the project scope. And in week 4, well, those artifacts help us clarify what the project will deliver and how the work is structured and what's included in the scope. And in week 4, we'll move that focus as a foundation to develop the next set of planning artifacts. And these include the schedule management plan or statement, a project milestone list, resource requirements, a roles and responsibility matrix. There's a couple of ways we can do that. One's called a RACI chart, and the other one's called a RAM, a responsibility assignment matrix, and the project schedule. And the schedule can, including identification of the critical path. And you can use a tool if you want to use, if you guys have access to a scheduling tool, that's great. Or you can use a spreadsheet to do this, or you can list the schedule out in a table format. You kind of see that work breakdown structure. The difference is you're going to be adding some what has to be done in first and what has to be done next to identify that critical path. This is important because the project schedule can be developed more effectively after we've clarified the scope and the objectives. And so in practice, the scope, schedule, and cost planning often overlap and evolve together. So the schedule development is also iterative. But for this course, the assignment keeps the deliverables simple as possible while still making them meaningful. At least I hope so. Again, we're doing this in a sort of a quasi-simulated way. And all these things kind of happen at the same time, but we're going to step through them in a linear fashion in the course to keep it from getting too complex. The key idea is that week 4 builds on week 3, and then week 5 will build on week 4, and so on. And once the project scope is defined and the work is structured, the next step is to determine how that work will be sequenced, resource assigned, and scheduled for delivery. So week 3 gives us the defined scope. Week 4 turns that into actionable schedule and implementation plan. So to conclude, the effective project scope planning turns a project from initial concept into a structured, communicated, and manageable foundation for delivery. The main message from this week is that project scope planning helps turn a broad idea into something structured, understandable, and manageable. It gives the project a clearer definition by identifying deliverables, boundaries, assumptions, constraints, and the major components of work. The second key takeaway is that scope planning is not a single step. It develops through connected planning processes, including planning scope management, collecting requirements, defining scope, creating a work breakdown structure. These processes help move the project from a general concept into more formal, organized planning foundation. Another point is that the WBS and the WBS dictionary help make the project work easier to understand and manage by organizing it into structured components and then clarifying those components with supporting detail. Together with the project scope statement, they form the scope baseline, which serves as the approved reference point for understanding project scope and future performance measurement. It's also important to remember that project scope planning depends on stakeholder input and requirement management. Stakeholder expectations, requirements, and communication all influence how scope is defined and how those elements continue to evolve the life cycle. That's why scope planning should be understood as both structured and iterative. And then week 3 is not an endpoint. The artifacts developed this week become important planning inputs to week 4, where we move into schedule development, resource planning, roles and responsibilities, and scheduling. And in that sense, scope planning is what prepares the project for more detailed implementation planning. Project planning turns initiation into structured scope, organized work. That's the end of the presentation. And your time and effort and commitment to this course is valued. Any questions or anything before we adjourn? I hope you're finding these presentations valuable. I enjoy putting them together for you. I always learn a little bit when I do them because there's a lot of things I take for granted that I realize that if I'm going to be presenting it, I should cover it. That's probably why there's another thing you'll notice is a lot of repetition in there. Learning is all about repetition and making the main points, solidifying those into your brain so that they'll be there. My goal is 15 years from now, you'll be working on a project and you'll remember something we talked about in this class. It's kind of where I'm at. All right. Y'all all have a good day and good night, and I'll see you next week. All righty.